We have breaking news just into the newsroom. A verdict has been reached in the Alec Murdaugh double murder trial. He's accused of killing his wife Maggie and son Paul in June of 2021.
The jury heard testimony over the past 6 weeks, and they deliberated this afternoon for about 3 hours before reaching a verdict. During the trial, Alec Murdaugh himself took to the stand in his own defense.
Everyone involved has been notified that a verdict has been reached. It has not yet been read. The minute it is, we will bring you that live.
We now return you to your regular scheduled programming.
Again, breaking news just into the newsroom. The judge in the Alec Murdaugh double murder case has entered the courtroom again, and he says, we understand that we have a verdict. A verdict has been reached in the double murder trial. Alec Murdaugh is accused of killing his wife Maggie and son Paul in June of 2021.
Right, yeah, the jury heard testimony over the past 6 weeks. They deliberated several hours this afternoon before reaching a verdict. During the trial, Alec Murdaugh himself took to the stand in his own defense, and there was a lot of back and forth over the financial crimes by the prosecution this week. They mentioned several financial crimes that he took place in, and really an interesting take there. They brought this up and they drug it out throughout the week, and I spoke with an attorney in the upstate, Davita Mathis. She said that could have come back to haunt the prosecution because they spent so much time on it in what is a murder trial.
Courtroom observers thought that this trial would probably last a couple of weeks. The introduction of all that financial information did extend it. It turned out to be a 6-week trial. Let's go right to the courtroom where the verdict is about to be read.
The defendant will rise. Madam Clerk, you may publish the verdict starting with the back, not with the, let's see, I'll tell you again. Starting with the back, flipping them over one by one.
Okay.
State of South Carolina versus.
Docket number 2022 GS 15-00592, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, in the Court of General Sessions in the term of 2022, July, the State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for murder, SC Code 16-3-0010, CDR Code 0116. You want me to turn it over? Okay. Guilty verdict. Signed by the forelady, 3/2/23. Docket number 2022 GS-15-00593. The State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, in the Court of General Sessions, the July term of 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for murder, SC Code 16-3-0010, CDR Code 0116, verdict guilty, signed by the forelady, date 3/2/23. Docket number 2022 GS-15-00595, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, Court of General Sessions, July term 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, SC Code -16-23-0490, CDR code 0549, verdict guilty, signed by the foreperson of the jury, date 3/2/23. Docket number 2022 GS-15-00594. The State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, Court of General Sessions, July term 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant. Indictment for possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. SC code 16-23-0490. CDR code 0549. Verdict guilty. Signed by the foreperson of the jury, 3/2/23.
Thank you. Madam Forelady and members of the jury, if that is the verdict of each and every juror, please let it be known by raising your right hands. All right, thank you. Any individual polling requested?
We do, Your Honor.
Madam Clerk, you'll need to individually poll the jury according to their juror numbers.
Number 193. Was this your verdict?
Yes, sir.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 254.
Yes.
Is this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 326. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 530. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 544.
Yes.
Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 572. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 578. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 589. Was this your verdict? Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 630. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 729. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 826. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 864. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Your Honor, the jury has been polled.
Thank you. The jury has been polled and the verdict is a unanimous verdict. If you will bring the alternate juror out and have her have a seat in the audience, please.
"54-year-old Alec Murdaugh facing the judge stoically. He has just been convicted of 2 counts of murder, 2 weapons counts, all 4 counts guilty. It is.
Are there any post-trial motions?
There have been a lot of courtroom observers who thought this would take a lot longer to decide. It came, the jury decided within about 3 hours.
Yeah, it was about 3:50 that the jury went back into chambers, and then 7 o'clock we got the verdict, so a little bit over 3 hours and 10 minutes. And several key points in this case that you could argue may have changed the trajectory, one of those being the kennel video. That was something that came up. Alec Murdaugh lying to SLED for 20 months. That was something that the prosecution brought up on the stand several times and said, hey, if you can lie about this to SLED investigators, what else could you lie about?
It was a key part in their closing arguments. And then he did admit, after that video was released, he did admit that he was there moments before Paul and Maggie Murdaugh were shot to death.
Yeah, and in his testimony, he mentioned a distrust of SLED. That was never really drawn out in testimony itself, but he mentioned that. Another interesting thing was the focus on the financial crimes this week and last week when he was testifying on the stand. The prosecution really brought out those crimes and said, hey, if you can lie about these to your clients, what's to say that you can't lie about killing Maggie and Paul?
One of the most dramatic pieces of testimony was when the prosecution said, did you lie to so-and-so? Yes. Did you lie to... He went through a list of dozens of people and said, did you lie to this person? And the answer was yes.
Right, and there was a concern by some, an upstate attorney that I spoke with said that that could have played against the prosecution because they spent so much time on it, because he's in a trial for murders, and they spent so much time on these financial crimes that could have bored the jury or taken the subject off of the murders themselves. But clearly, 3 hours and change, a verdict's been reached. That clearly didn't happen.
And it's interesting you mentioned the financial information, because he still faces many charges, dozens of charges regarding some financial improprieties that may have happened with clients, with his fellow lawyers in his law practice. That trial is still ahead. What is known is that he could face 30 years to life in prison with these convictions on the murder counts. Of course, in South Carolina, the sentencing will come at a later date.
Yeah, and one thing that Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor, brought up as well during testimony was Alec Murdaugh worked in a courtroom. He spent a lot of time in a courtroom. His comment was he had knowledge of how criminal cases worked and what getting on the stand looked like, and perhaps he was able to use that to his advantage in his testimony.
Let's return to the courtroom where the judge is talking about sentencing.
We will defer sentencing to a later date. Of course, the minimum sentence for murder is 30 years. The maximum sentence is life imprisonment as to each count. And on the weapons charge, the sentence is up to 5 years, or 5 years, which has to be concurrent if a life sentence is imposed. When would you all like to reconvene for sentencing? I would like to give everyone an adequate opportunity to prepare for it.
State will be ready at 9:30 in the morning, Your Honor.
We could do it at 9:30 tomorrow morning also.
All right. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the Colleton County Sheriff's Department. And he may be taken away.
Sentencing is going to happen very fast in this case. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, both sides agree they will be back in court. Sometimes sentencing can be delayed for a week or two. Apparently not so in this case.
Yeah, and the judge talking about the potential sentencing for each one of those charges. I know 30 years to life in prison if he's convicted of either murder count, but state, again, like you said, very quick to jump on 9:30 tomorrow morning for potential sentencing.
If you are just joining us, let's bring you up to speed. Alec Murdaugh, his murder case has made national and international headlines for months now. His murder trial has concluded with him being convicted of 2 counts of murder, 2 weapons charges. The 54-year-old faces a minimum of 30 years, a maximum of life in prison. That was if he was convicted of either murder count, and he has been convicted of both.
Yeah, and on all 4 counts, the 2 weapons charges as well. You know, this was a case that went on for 6 weeks. It, like you said, captivated attention everywhere, and some really interesting points throughout the trial talking about his financial crimes, starting with the murders, but talking about his financial crimes, talking about his addiction, and the prosecution using those as ways to say this was a man that had extreme family pressures. This was a man that was under a lot of pressure in his life, and that could have been the reason why he did that. The defense coming back and saying essentially agents were so determined to get Murdaugh convicted that they rushed through the process. But this has been happening since June of 2021.
It'll be interesting in the weeks and months ahead to find out exactly what swayed the jurors. One has to think the timeline probably had something to do with it, where with the video showing he was at the hunting estate 2-3 minutes before the murders happened.
Yeah, and you think about that video, he lied to SLED investigators for 20 months, and then when this video was obtained, the story changed. And prosecution used that, as we've talked about throughout this, they used that and said, if you can lie about this, you can lie to SLED investigators, a state agency, about something like the murders of your wife and your son, what else can you lie about?
The murders happened in June of 2021 in Colleton County, which is in the Low Country. Investigators said 22-year-old Paul was shot twice with a shotgun. 52-year-old wife Maggie was shot 4 or 5 times with a rifle outside of the kennels on their hunting estate.
Yeah, and Creighton Waters brought up actually twice, if I recall, throughout the testimony, once last week and then once in his closing argument, calling Murdaugh a, quote, family annihilator, something he said, so really leaning into that in their closing argument. You know, and again, Jim Griffin, the attorney, said investigators focused solely on Murdaugh and that they rushed through it. So that was the back and forth between the prosecutors and the defense throughout the closing arguments and throughout the case itself.
And again, if you're just joining us, this isn't the end of Alec Murdaugh's appearances in court. Even tomorrow morning, there are still some financial charges that he faces. We were just talking about the exact number. It's literally dozens of cases where prosecutors say that he lied and he cheated clients in the law firm, lied and cheated friends, lifelong friends, lied and cheated lawyers in the firm as well.
And we talked about this earlier as well. You know, each one of those, they brought it up on the stand and said, did you lie to this person? Yes. Did you lie to this person? Yes. So really making this compelling case that he spent a lot of time with his clients and lied to each and every one of them. He mentioned in his testimony that he couldn't remember the exact details of a lot of it, but answering in the affirmative that he did cheat them of money.
It's important to note that the weapons have never been found in this case. The defense made a big case out of the fact that a murder of this type, murders of this type would have created a big blood splash, and there was no blood found on his clothing. He apparently had changed clothes at some point, according to some of the visual evidence as well. But we had some legal analysts say you can have circumstantial evidence and it's still evidence.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's what Davita Mathis, the attorney in the upstate I spoke with about this case last week. She said that. She said the burden is on the prosecution to prove the case. Circumstantial evidence is there, but there should be evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. But there was a lot of circumstantial evidence throughout this entire case across the board, with the financial crimes, with the addiction, that it's hard to ignore that, even as a jury that's focused specifically on the murder trial, the murder cases themselves.
You know, many people talk about the fact that it's hard to have privacy in this day and age when we all carry one of these around, but this is probably one of the key prosecution weapons in this case, was the fact that there was a video on Paul Murdaugh's phone that linked his father to that site just before the murder.
That, and then just the amount of sheer data that they presented during the trial. They presented data from Alec Murdaugh's Suburban, where he was, what time he was there, his phone, how many steps he took. The prosecution brought up that at one point during when the murders took place, there were more steps on his phone. They really went down into the data with this, from his phone, from his car, to determine this. And it just, like you said, goes to show you what those little devices in our pockets can do.
They certainly can. Well, another key part of this case that was talked about by the defense was the fact that Alec Murdaugh was an admitted drug addict. He had a very heavy drug bill every week. It went into the thousands of dollars, and that in a way was also something the defense tried to bring forward as an excuse for his lies.
Yeah, and the prosecution really hammered that home as much as they could, like we talked about, between the financial crimes, the addiction. Alec Murdaugh saying he took, I believe it was hundreds of oxycodone pills throughout when it got to a certain point, took several hundred oxycodone pills. And the prosecution, rather, used that as a way to say, you know, this was a man that was an addict. This was a man that was a habitual liar with his clients. And if he's doing all of this and he's under these extreme family pressures and he's lying about this, then it's not too far to say that he could have possibly murdered Maggie and Paul. Then, of course, the defense saying, you know, a lot of this evidence is circumstantial.
We want to remind you that our Taggart Hauk is on the scene in Colleton County, and as soon as possible we will get him on the air to talk about what's happening there now in Colleton County.
Yeah, he's been following this for the 6 weeks. Spent the first week in Colleton County, is down there now, talking through the nuts and bolts of the case itself and really diving into day by day the changes in the prosecution's arguments, the defense's arguments, as we've uncovered these things about Alec Murdaugh, as the addiction came to light, as the financial crimes came to light, as the phone data came to light and the suburban data came to light, the video where Alec Murdaugh's voice could be heard on it. He's been covering this all throughout the past 6 weeks.
It will be interesting to find out what his reaction is, because it was very hard to read Alec Murdaugh's countenance when the sentence was read.
Yeah, and even throughout the trial, a lot of different moments for Alec Murdaugh. We saw very different Alec Murdaughs depending on whether he was on the stand, his facial expressions when he was watching in the courtroom, obviously emotional as he was talking about Maggie and Paul, Paw as he calls him. You know, there were a lot of different moments for him. You can see here live video outside of the courthouse in Colleton County.
That courthouse has probably not been that well lit in ever, perhaps. Yeah. But this is where Alec Murdaugh will be taken out and escorted back to jail.
Yeah, and we watched each morning as he came in. You know, one of the interesting things, and a lot of times in court cases they'll do this, where he had his suit jacket over the handcuffs as he got out of the van each day. Press were standing there waiting for him to get out of the van, and he walked in the same way pretty much every single day for the past 6 weeks.
You know, it's an interesting family story. The Murdaughs have been very prominent in judicial and legal circles in that part of South Carolina for decades. His grandfather, his father, his grandfather, perhaps his great-grandfather, all involved in establishing law practices in that county, well known throughout the Low Country. It's a real story of how the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, and interesting as well, when he took the stand against the advice of his counsel, and this was something prosecution hammered home over the past several weeks. They talked about, you know, this is a man that spent a lot of time in a courtroom. He knows exactly how the courtroom works. He knows exactly how to make an argument, and he spent a lot of time doing this, and so he knows how it works. He knows how the game is run, if you will. And that was an argument prosecution said was, you know, take everything he says at face value, because this man's been in this game for a long time.
Let's bring you up to speed if you are just joining us. Alec Murdaugh, 54 years old, a prominent lawyer in the Low Country, was convicted tonight of double murder in the deaths of his son Paul, who was 22 years old when he died in 2021, and his 52-year-old wife, Maggie. They were both shot to death on the family's hunting estate in Colleton County, and actually shot outside of the kennels on that property. Yeah, and they spent, we talked about this a moment ago, but the jury went back to their chambers at, I believe it was 3:50, and we got the verdict, or notification of the verdict, at 7 o'clock, so about 3 hours and 10 minutes. So this was a quick move by the jury, and they found him guilty on all 4 charges, on the 2 murder charges and the 2 weapons charges. And this week the jury asked, well, I don't know if they asked, but they were taken to the murder scene to actually see the logistics of the place. How far were the bodies apart when they were found? Where exactly were they found? A big question was, why would somebody use 2 weapons unless there were 2 shooters? That was a flag the defense raised. So the jury actually got to see the logistics of the place. Yeah, and it was interesting when we spoke to legal analysts. There's 2 schools of thought there. One is they got out to Moselle, they got to see the place, they got to see where those murders took place. And on one hand, that gives them a better view of what it looks like and how the incident took place. On the other hand, some of our legal analysts said that they walk out there, they see it, they see the amount of the money the Murdaughs have, they see the sprawling property, and then that could plant some doubt in their mind, which it clearly didn't because we had the verdict. But at the time, that could plant some seeds of doubt in their mind, because this is a man that comes from means, this is a man that has a lot of money. That stretch of did he kill his son and kill his wife may have gotten a little bit further. We are waiting now for him to be taken out of the courthouse and returned back behind bars. He was handcuffed after the verdict was read, and we expect him to exit the building at any point now. Yeah, and we mentioned this. In each day throughout the 6 weeks, 6+ weeks of the trial, he would cover his handcuffs with his jacket. Very public show in the courtroom of him being turned around, handcuffed.
and preparing for him to exit now. But it's been 6 full weeks of key moments throughout the 6 weeks, where we started out this trial on trial for the murder of Maggie and Paul. Then the video came out, the video where you could hear Alec Murdaugh's voice in the background. Then the data came out from his Suburban, from his cell phone, and the prosecution using each one of these moments to say, hey, here's one more nugget, here's one more nugget. He walked X number of steps at this point when we know when Paul and Maggie were murdered. And each time data points were used to further give that circumstantial evidence.
You know, the defense made the point that you know, there were people that might have wanted to wish harm on the Murdaughs. But at one point the prosecution got up and said, so you expect us to believe that, and they went right through the timeline. And it, you know, it is perhaps that piece of evidence that impressed the jury.
Yeah, and each one of those, you know, I think when you see it on a screen and you see these very clear data points of here's where the car was, even though those don't directly, circumstantial evidence, it doesn't directly tie them to it, but they see those little data points times 10, times 20, times 30, that becomes a compelling argument. And then the prosecution brought in the addiction, they brought in the financial crimes, so it was almost this just one thing after another as we went throughout the trial. And they brought up several of those moments in the closing arguments, Creighton Waters calling him a, quote, family annihilator, saying that he had defrauded clients, that it's not too far of a stretch to say that given that he could have murdered Alec and Paul. There was a lot to unpack in 6 weeks of a trial.
You know, and it's also not too much of a stretch to say that this case has really captured the world's imagination. There are several podcasts that were created specifically to follow this case, and this is just one aspect of the Alec Murdaugh story. We've mentioned the financials, we've mentioned the case where he said he had a flat on the side of the road and somebody tried to shoot at him. There is so much involved in this case, and it is such a story. Yeah,
and one of the challenges that the prosecution, I'm sure, had was they had all of these moments, these circumstantial evidence moments, if you will. They had the time where the car slowed down, where they believed that Maggie's cell phone was thrown out of the car, where I believe it was 42 miles per hour, where the car slowed down after it was doing 70+ miles per hour. That's just one example of the cell phone data, the car data, the addiction, the financial crimes. And you know, it's tough. I'm sure it's tough as a prosecutor to say, I've got all of this data. How do I make it? How do I tell a story that's understandable to a jury to link that circumstantial evidence?
We remember the days when they talked about the car information, for example. That stuff can be very particular, but it can also be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of information there. You know, the slowing down and the slowing down near the spot where Maggie's phone was found, then the speeding up, the time. You know, you really almost need a flow chart to follow it.
You do, and when the defense questioned some of those analysts, one thing stood out for me a couple of weeks ago. You know, they said, well, planning that reasonable doubt, they said, hey, do you know that he was walking? Even though he had his phone in his pocket, they admitted that there were gaps of time that they couldn't account for, and they said, well, how do you know that he was walking there? How do you know? We have these very black and white data points, but we don't know the specifics in between. And that was something that stuck out. The defense really tried to hammer home that, hey, yes, they have this data, but there could be some gray areas in between this data.
Let's go back to the beginning. If you are just joining us, it's 7:30 now. We have been waiting probably about 10 minutes for Alec Murdaugh to come out of the courthouse and be returned back behind bars. If you are just joining us, 54-year-old Alec Murdaugh, a prominent Lowcountry attorney accused of killing his wife and one of his sons, was convicted tonight of those charges plus 2 weapons charges. He faces 30 years at minimum to life in prison, and both sides agreed to come back into court at 9:30 tomorrow morning to hear the verdict.
Yeah, very quick on the state's part. State immediately said, we'll see you back here in the morning at 9:30. Defense conferred for about a minute and then said 9:30 sounds good for us as well. So this is the culmination of 6+ weeks of a trial that has captivated everybody, captivated national audiences, captivated international audiences as well. And it's been like we've talked about, it's been a story from start to finish of all of these new things being introduced. What we thought at the beginning of the trial, lots of new data by the end of the trial.
And the story seemingly began with a boating accident that Paul Murdaugh was involved in, where a woman died. And from that, we understand that there were some financial problems created by Alec Murdaugh. That's the allegation. That trial is yet to come. That's just an allegation at this point. The murders, the attempt on Alec Murdaugh's life, what he said was an attempt on his life. It's a broad story, and it gets more and more complicated, and elements of that were used in this trial as well. Yeah,
I think we'll all look back at some point and say, what was the pivot point in the trial, right? What was the pivot point where the jury thought, okay, this man is guilty of this? And one of the points that always comes back to mind is the video. For months, for 20 months, he lied to SLED investigators saying he wasn't there. Then this video surfaced where you could hear his voice in the background, and he said, oh, I actually was there. And so this was a 20-month-long lie throughout the initial investigation, throughout part of the trial itself, until it came to light. And that was that character. That was something prosecution just kept hitting over and over and over again. They said, if you can lie about this, this is a moment that you saw, you look down, and even if, let's say you didn't do it, you're looking down and seeing your wife and your son dead. Why was your first reaction to lie to SLED investigators? That's telling. That says something. And besides that, and we've mentioned this several times so far, the prosecution had a list of names of people who have claimed that Alec Murdaugh cheated them out of money. In some cases, large amounts of money. And they would name a name. Did you lie to him? Yes. Did you lie to him? Yes. Dozens of names on that list. Yeah, and that and the addiction came out at a later point in the trial as well, and prosecution very clearly used both of those things to say, this is a person that was under extreme duress. This was a person that felt like his world, and I'm paraphrasing something that the prosecution, Creighton Waters, said, felt like his world was collapsing from all sides, and that led him to commit these crimes. We are seeing no action from the courthouse yet. There are figures near the van. We're not exactly sure if that's press or somebody waiting for him to exit the courthouse and get into that van. That's what we're waiting for right now. And as we mentioned, Alec Murdaugh will return to court tomorrow morning at 9:30. It was what the prosecution suggested, and as you mentioned, after consultation, the defense agreed to hear what the sentence could be. It could be 30 years. It could be life in prison. It could be anywhere in between. Yeah, and it's interesting. This is where he comes in the mornings as well. He gets out of that van, that black van that you see in the left corner of the screen there with that live video. And this morning, he actually took a pause, and I don't believe we found out why he took that pause, but this morning he stopped there for, I would say, about a minute with sheriff's deputies and with the people that were escorting him in, and took some time there. But again, every single morning, jacket, the same look and feel, if you will, gets out of the van, jackets over his handcuffs, walks in through that fence that you see just above the caution thing there on the ground. He walks in right there every single morning, so that right there is where we believe he'll walk out of here in just moments. Yeah, we're seeing a little bit more action. It looks like some of the photographers are getting into place, kind of jockeying for a good position to take their picture or take their video as well. It's an interesting case that is not over yet. No, it's not, and it's, we've talked about this as well. There's the financial aspect. That's a whole different case and a whole different trial. Even though those were brought up throughout the 6 weeks, they use that as kind of a character assault, if you will. But there's that as well. So even though he was convicted on all 4 of these charges, the jury found him guilty on the 2 murder charges, the 2 weapons charges, there could still be much more to come for Alec Murdaugh, and we've said this as well. He faces 30 years to life in prison if he was convicted of either murder count. So he's got these charges plus potentially more in the future. Yeah, and he also has the 2 weapons charges, which will carry a sentence. And of course, we have to wonder if it'll be concurrent or if they will add that on to whatever sentence
they do give him.
Yeah, that was something the judge was mentioning towards the end there. I know we caught some audio of it right before they agreed to come back at 9:30 in the morning, talking about how those sentences would run. And then, obviously, with the potential financial crimes trial as well, there's the additional charges that could be tacked onto that. It's hard to imagine a world, if and when that does go to trial, given that he's admitted in this trial that he defrauded several of his clients, answering, like we talked about, yes to each one of these meticulous questions as they went throughout the case. Did you defraud this client? Yes. Did you defraud this client? Yes.
And allowing that testimony was a big victory for the prosecution, because if you remember, that was not going to be part of the trial, that financial information. And the prosecution made a special plea to the judge, can we introduce this? We want to show a pattern of behavior. And the judge did allow it. So one has to think, although that did add a lot of time to this trial, that it was important in establishing character.
Yeah, it's one thing if you have the data, you have the car data, you have the phone data, but then when you establish this repetitiveness of his behavior, the defrauding people, the lying to SLED, that brings that question into people's minds of, what's his character like? It's not just data on a screen looking at these black and white cell phone data points or these car data points. Now there's some character attached to it as well.
Let's go through a rundown of this whole case and what the defense and the prosecution said. As we wait, you might be wondering, why are we focusing on this black van and the courthouse building? We are waiting for Alec Murdaugh to come out and get into the van and be transported back to jail. 54-year-old Alec Murdaugh, he has been convicted tonight after about 3 hours of deliberation by the jury of 2 counts of murder and 2 weapons counts. He faces 30 years to life in prison, and that was if he was convicted of either murder count. Now, investigators said his 22-year-old son Paul was shot twice with a shotgun. The injuries, from what we understand during testimony, were horrific and, of course, killed him. And then his 52-year-old wife Maggie was shot 4 or 5 times with a rifle outside of the kennels on their property. I don't know if they established during the trial, and perhaps you know, Aaron, who was shot first.
That is a good question. I'm drawing a blank on that one. They did bring in people to talk about the trajectory of the guns. You may remember, I want to say it was about a week ago or a couple of days ago, they brought in analysts to testify on the trajectory and how they were shot. There was some conversation brought up about a potential second shooter theory, but then obviously he was found guilty, so that came up. But it was just it started in June of 2021. That was when they were killed, and he lied to SLED investigators for 20 months saying he wasn't there, when in fact the video proves from Paul's phone that he was there. So we had these moments throughout this trial of, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, all of these different key moments. And as those came out, it almost created this snowball effect of, we saw this video, we saw this character testimony, we saw this, and I would presume for the jury, once you have all of that together, it presents a pretty compelling
and
circumstantial story. Yeah, and overwhelming, yeah.
And the prosecutor, Creighton Waters, told jurors on Wednesday that Murdaugh's theft of millions of dollars was about to be revealed, so he killed his wife and son to buy time to figure a way out. That was the prosecution's, that's what they maintained throughout this whole thing. Yeah,
and they talked about, they introduced these points throughout. They introduced his addiction. They talked pretty extensively about that. They talked about, and he mentioned that on the stand as well. And then they brought in the other character element, the defrauding his clients. And he testified on the stand, this is important to mention, that he testified on the stand against his counsel's advice. So that was an interesting point within itself. We spent 2 days, I believe it was, on the stand, and this former attorney that knows the ins and outs of a courtroom, testifying on his own behalf, which a lot of attorneys advise their clients to do that in a lot of cases, against the advice of his counsel. And we saw an emotional at times Murdaugh, we saw a somber at times Murdaugh, going through details of each one of his financial crimes. The question would be, what was the benefit of him doing that? Well, in his mind, and I don't know that we'll ever know that, but as a seasoned attorney, former attorney. What was going through his mind? Was it a, this can help me redeem my character? Was this a, hey, I can get up here and convince them?
Well, the prosecution said that he was attempting to be a sympathetic figure. And they maintain that the murders were a way for him to get that sympathy from the public. But at the end, when they were wrapping up, the prosecution said, I have no doubt that Alec Murdaugh loved his son. I have no doubt that he loved his wife, but I think he loved himself more. Yeah, both, essentially saying that both those things can exist together. He can love his family and also commit these crimes. They spent a lot of time going through each one of those character attacks, if you will, and saying, if he can do this, if he can look you in the eye, a client in the eye, and say, I'm taking care of your money and not taking care of your money, if he can have this addiction and have these family pressures, it's not that far of a stretch to say that he murdered Alec and Paul. And then jury went to Mizell, as we've talked about, their estate this week, spent some time looking at the crime scene, and perhaps that was a key moment in it as well, where they actually saw that this, it's one thing to talk about these things in a courtroom, but actually seeing the property. Yeah. To be there. Yeah. We should also mention that there was a little bit of drama with the jury earlier today. One of the jurors was accused of talking about the case to two people outside of the jury, outside of the courtroom. She was brought before the judge. He talked to her and then dismissed her, and one of the alternates went in for her, and of course was part of the group that decided this case. Yeah, and another interesting point from this case, the weapons were never found either, so that was a key piece. And throughout the trial, mentioning, like we've said, trajectories of how the shots were fired, and going through these meticulous data points, but then trying to tie that together into a story. So they had these moments, if you will, where it was pretty conclusive that the car was here, the phone was here, his walking rate, or the phones, wherever the phone was, the walking rate increased, but trying to tie that together into a storyline, a slew, if you will, of circumstantial evidence, trying to tie that into a storyline that he in fact committed these crimes. It's always interesting, Aaron, to see how long a jury is going to take to decide. And in this case, discussions among us in the newsroom, some people thought it could literally take more time. It could take a week. It could take longer than that. I don't think anybody thought it would take this fast. No, and it was, and there's the general rule of thumb. Obviously, it doesn't happen like this all the time, but the longer it takes, the more likely that the person can be found not guilty. That if there's a lot of deliberation going on, that the jury is really struggling to reach a verdict. And obviously, when we were here moments ago at 7 o'clock and we heard that the jury had reached a verdict, that was shocking. I mean, that was they adjourned at 3:50 in the afternoon, so this was 3 hours. They got the case at 3:50, almost 4 o'clock, and then by 7 o'clock we had the verdict. Yeah, it is fascinating. We have our Taggart Houck live in Colleton County as well with the latest as to what we're seeing down there. Taggart, what can you tell us about what you're seeing outside of the courtroom this evening?
Hey, Aaron, yeah, we're just kind of on the back side of the courthouse here, and I'll just kind of step out of the shot, but you've got a crowd of people, and it is a combination of reporters, but a lot of it it's just people who have come out to see what's about to happen, and that is Alec Murdaugh being taken back in that transport van to the detention center where he's been staying. And I don't know if you can get a really good idea of it from that angle, but essentially his van has been pulling up here every single day of this trial, and I'm kind of getting the feeling this is only about a minute or two away, because we've got a bit more of a presence here now. But he's going to walk out through that gate where you see the hedges are. That's the way he's come in and out. And I mean, it's hard to guess. There's probably at least 100 people who are out here just watching this, between press and just people who've come out to see it. But I do want to speak a little bit about inside the courtroom. I was inside the courtroom when that verdict. It's happening now, is that what you said? So it looks like he's going to be coming out, and I'm going to do my best to make sure we can see all of this. We've got a vehicle coming by, too. You good, Dustin? Yep. Yeah, okay. Excuse us for 1 second. Anyway, when we were inside the courtroom, it really only took about 3 hours for that decision to be made by the jury. And Alec Murdaugh, after hearing that, appeared to mouth "I love you" to his son Buster, who was sitting back there, before he was ultimately put in handcuffs and then let out by these folks here. But it appears we are very close to Alec Murdaugh walking out. And I'm sorry, I know you're seeing a lot of cars that are going by and the wheels. That's just to give you an idea of kind of how chaotic this scene is right now. And it's a very small space, a very tight window that we...
Obviously, it looks like Dustin, our photographer, was attempting to move past the line of cars, and we lost contact. But of course, we will try to get that back as soon as we can.
Yeah, let's just recap from the top. You know, moments ago, 7 o'clock, the jury reached a verdict. Alec Murdaugh convicted on both counts of murder, both counts of weapons charges. Really a fast verdict. I mean, we saw again 3:50 was when they went back to discuss the verdict. 7 o'clock, about 3 hours and 10 minutes. That's not a long time.
You know, we've heard a lot of legal analysts. We've had some in ourselves. We've had some attorneys in. I don't think anybody could really predict what would happen with this case. There was so much information. There was a big effort on both sides, from the prosecution and the defense. Didn't know if it would be a couple of weeks, the jury deliberating, or, as it turned out tonight, 3 hours. Taggart Hoke, we have you back again. 3 hours. Taggart Hoke, we have you back again.
Yeah. Hey, Carol. Yeah. So I'm going to give you an idea. We've got a vehicle rolling up here, and it does look like within the next minute we are going to see Alec Murdaugh walk out of the courthouse for the first time as a man who's been found guilty in the death of his wife and son. They're getting everybody lined up right now. Gonna back up here. Okay, here we go. This is just an idea of how chaotic it is here. A lot of people at this tiny property outside the courthouse. I'm gonna stay quiet here so you get an idea for what is happening. But he's going to be walking through that gate any second now.
Taggart, we noticed a lot of armed officers coming in. They're doing this specifically for this walk, or have they been on site for the whole trial?
Yeah, they have been, but we haven't seen them quite like this, Carol. It's certainly a much greater presence than what we've seen on the day in and day out. But that being said, it's also a much greater public presence. Typically, it's just the media that's been out here. But we have a lot of other people who are here. And you can just understand how much of a logistical challenge this probably is for people who are in law enforcement working to get him back in that van.
And Taggart, it's probably a good idea to remind people of Colleton County is a pretty close-knit county. There, not a lot of people live there. A lot of people know the Murdaughs. So I can imagine people at home hearing the verdict saying, let's run down to the courthouse and see what we can see.
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen too, Carol. There's been quite a bit of people who've some even shouted across the street, and some that, they were happy to hear about this. So I think it's a very interesting, and that probably plays a very large role. Here he comes. That probably plays a large role into this. Okay, get ready. There he is right there, Alec Murdaugh, walking out of the courthouse for the first time as a guilty man, convicted in the death of his wife and son.
Are you surprised at his demeanor, Taggart? He doesn't seem to be showing much emotion at all.
No, and Carol, that's also been the case throughout the trial. These walks have been brief. We get about maybe 5 or 6 seconds. Okay, we're being instructed to get out of the road here. We're going to do that. It has been brief. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Yep, I understand. So it has been brief. Usually these walks are a couple of seconds, but he always has a pretty straight demeanor and somewhat somber. Today we actually got him for a little bit longer. I'm not sure why, but they actually had him stop in front of the gate for about 35 seconds today before he walked in. But here's the van coming out. Just a reminder, he's being kept at the detention center just down the road from us. So his commute to court is about 2 or 3 minutes each day, and that presumably is where he's going to be headed back for the night.
Taggart, do we know if he's being
the van is
kept
backing up
out of the general jail population?
From what I've been told, it's a holding cell, and there are a couple there. But he's been there during the course. Of course, you know, we all thought this trial was going to be 3 weeks. So I think that temporary arrangement, you know, of course, was made for that, but he certainly succeeded. Okay, so we now have the van away, but look at, hey, Dustin, can we pan over? Dustin's doing a great job of this because it is crazy out here, but look at all the people that are, you know, walking on the streets, many of which are not members of the media. They just came out to see this. And I want to see if maybe we can talk to somebody here. Sorry, I just tripped you up there a little bit.
Taggart, while you're looking at that, looking to talk to somebody, you know, you've covered this trial for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Was it shocking to get the verdict back in 3 hours?
Hey, sir, excuse me, can we, I'm with Channel 4, the NBC's, can we talk to you about why you came out here tonight? Are you just want to see
We came out because this is First Thursday, and usually this street is closed to only to foot traffic. It's a kind of an economic boost, and however that's been changed for the last, this is second month that this has changed our town for quite a long time. We got friends of deputies, there's friends that are in the courtroom, sketch artists. We have people on both sides that we rub elbows with in the stores, and it's been interesting, controversial. Everybody has their opinions. I'm not going to voice mine, but wow, it's a life changer for him, that's for sure.
What did you think when he walked into that van?
Life changed. It's sad. It's my heart's broken for everyone. It's not just him, and not just the deceased, but the family, everyone. There's the friends of the family. The roots go deep, and there's a lot of affected people, and it's tragic. So,
thank you for taking.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for taking the time.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yep.
Enjoy.
Aaron, I'm sorry I interrupted your question. What was that?
No, not at all. No worries, Taggart.
We'll
My
go
question
around this
was, you followed this closely for 6+ weeks. What was it like for you? Was it shocking that the verdict came back in 3 hours and change, 3 hours and 10 minutes? Was that expected? What were your thoughts after covering this for several weeks?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry we're walking. Alan Wilson, Attorney General Alan Wilson's holding a press conference here, so we're getting over to that. But I would say surprised. I mean, I think a lot of us really believe that this was something that was going to go into tomorrow, maybe even Monday. We had a good idea it wasn't going to go into the weekend, but probably Monday. So to see that 3 hours, I guess you could believe that perhaps a lot of people on the jury. Whoops, are we good now? Okay. Perhaps a lot of people knew this, you know, over 6 weeks. We're going to walk up to this press conference. We will toss it back to you, and we'll be out here. If you want to come back to us at some point, we're happy to show you what we're seeing. Okay, thanks, guys.
We'll definitely see you at 11 o'clock with a full report.
Yeah, one thing the gentleman mentioned that Taggart interviewed that I think goes unsaid sometimes when we're covering this case, even on a statewide level, but on a national level and international level, is just how sad it is. I mean, this is a close-knit community. Colleton County is not a large county.
Yeah.
People that know each other, people that spend a lot of time together. So as somebody that lives there, I can't imagine.
Yeah, in fact, one sentence he said jumped out at me. The roots go deep. A lot of affected people.
Right, and then all of a sudden this happening right there.
If you're just joining us, once again, let's clue you in that 54-year-old Alec Murdaugh, a prominent low-country attorney, Colleton County, has been convicted in the murders of his wife and his son. It looks like he will learn his jail sentence tomorrow morning. It could be 30 years to life in prison.
And we will have all this and more coming up tonight on WYFF News 4 at 11 as well. We'll recap all throughout the day, the guilty verdict, and what's next in the Alec Murdaugh trial.
We return you now to local programming.